I will welcome everyone and let's take our roll call, if you don't mind, Mr. Newberry.
Member Gunther. Councilmember Clark.
Here.
Member Boykin. Councilmember Edens. Member Sturman.
Here.
Member Holthouse. Councilmember Farmer.
Here.
Member Berger.
Here.
Councilmember McCutcheon.
Here.
Member Patton. Councilmember Rambo. Member Donaldson. Councilmember Garitano. Councilmember McKeon. Co-Chair Remy.
Present.
Co-Chair Chesky.
Here.
And I see Mr. Patton right there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, so we have 9 members of our task force here tonight. And our next up is our opening remarks by myself and Co-Chair Archesky. So I'll just say a few remarks. So I had the privilege yesterday of having a meeting with Mr. Brown, Mr. Vunich, Mr. Archesky, Mr. Cross. We're looking forward to this meeting. In interest of the beautiful weather outside, and quite frankly, for us to be efficient, I'm going to take a page from Councilmember McCutcheon's book. And let's try to keep this meeting with a hard deadline of ending it tonight at 7:30. And let's try to keep our meeting to about an hour and a half. That way we can move through at least what's on our current agenda. We have some important things we definitely want to get through this evening, including hearing the presentation from MSD, but equally important, we need to be able to pass legislation to go back to go to council so that they can evaluate the stormwater and parks tax. So with that, I hope that we can move through that pretty judiciously and quickly to this evening. And the hope for the next month meeting is to really tackle 3 main areas. One is to get an update from our consultant, Mr. Jones's firm, as well as hear from the wonderful work that Mr. Patton and Ms. Holthouse and Councilmember Clark have been doing in the Education Committee. And we're going to do that at the front and center in the beginning of the meeting, and then also include in that meeting also the next steps for development of a watershed master plan. So with that, I hope to get this meeting started and let's move expeditiously through things as we can tonight. Co-Chair Archesky, do you have any comments?
No, I don't.
All right. So with that, we will entertain a motion to at least look at the minutes for the meeting by Councilmember Farmer, seconded by Councilmember McCutcheon. Any questions on the motion?
Mr. Co-Chair.
Where was the meeting notes?
Mr. Co-Chair.
Yes, sir.
I have the proverbial, the dog ate my homework. So you did not get a set of minutes in full form. I worked on them over the weekend, placed them on SharePoint, and I can't find them. So we're going to have to do some investigating. And so I would ask that they be deferred to our April meeting, with my apologies.
So Councilmember Farmer, would you mind modifying your motion to just postpone until the next meeting?
Nope, I'll postpone the next meeting.
And is that okay with our seconder, Councilmember McCutcheon? Okay, we will postpone the minutes and make sure everyone has a hall pass for next month so that we can get through school without a problem. So we will postpone that. Thanks for bringing that up. All right, so next up is public comment. Mr. Newberry, do we have any public comments tonight from our 2 attendees?
The 2 attendees are the representatives from MSD. So.
Okay. Well, then we will hold for them for their next part of the meeting, which will be their presentation. So if they want to set up and we can move them over for their presentation, let's move on to our presentation by MSD. And we are certainly happy that our representatives from MSD are going to be presenting information. We certainly have a number of targeted projects for this group. And we really would like to work judiciously with this group so that we can find some of the answers to many of the projects that are both Wildwood and MSD areas of priority. So with that, I will turn it over to our friends from MSD.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can get our presentation started here.
While Jeff does that, first off, thank you for the invitation to the task force for allowing us the opportunity to be here tonight. My name is Saad. I'm working MSD. You're right. Yes, I am still at the office. Yes. Yes. So I work in public affairs, and I'll be helping sort of Jeff with this presentation. Perfect. Yeah, Jeff, you got it.
Is that showing correctly now?
Yeah, you're good.
Okay.
All right, and I think we should be good to go.
All right.
All right, so just quickly to kind of give you an idea of what we're going to be doing tonight, I'm going to start off with kind of an MSD overview and a stormwater responsibility overview for MSD, just to make sure we're all on the same page. I suspect that most of you have heard this information several times, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page before we start talking about these specific investigations. So we are MSD. MSD Project Clear is a government utility. It is a provision of the state constitution. We were formed by the voters of St. Louis City and County in 1954. At that time, our boundaries only went out to about 270. And in the 1970s, out to about Route 109 in Wildwood was added to MSD's service area, and that was only through the vote of the people. We are two utilities. I'm not going to read the entire thing, because I'm sure you guys all are pretty aware of what MSD is. But I do want to point out one specific thing. We are two utilities in one. We're wastewater, which is obviously, as you all know, the water that comes from the houses, from the toilets, sinks, dishwashers, washing machines. All of that is transmitted through MSD sewers to one of the 7 MSD treatment plants, which is then cleaned and released back into the environment. So that's wastewater. Stormwater, as you're all aware, is a completely separate funding mechanism. So that utility in and of itself is funded by a completely different source of revenue stream. And we cannot use wastewater funds for stormwater issues and vice versa. And as we'll go through on the next slide when I get to it, we'll kind of explain the complexity of that stormwater responsibilities and how that differs through different parts of the service area. Just a couple of quick more facts that I think are pretty important. A lot of people don't realize we have about 520 square miles in our service area, which is about 90% of the county and the entirety of the city. You'll see the thousands of miles of sewers that are listed on the right-hand column. What that really leads to is that St. Louis has the 4th largest sewer system in the entire country. And that really, really drives the costs associated with our operations. So now we can move over, Jeff, to the stormwater responsibilities and sort of the history. So just to make sure we're all on the same page with what's been happening with MSD and stormwater, there's been a couple of different propositions on the ballot that deal with different types of things. So let's start off with 2016, and that's when we had Proposition S in 2016. So this was approved with 62% of the vote. And what the reason why this version of Proposition S was passed was because there was an inequitable distribution of stormwater services throughout the district. I mentioned that up until the 1970s, the district went out to about that 270 mark. Those municipalities within that area are part of special taxing districts that allowed them to do capital improvement projects and also maintenance of their stormwater systems. Before 2016, across the service area, MSD did not have the funds or the legal mechanisms to even maintain the public storm system. So in 2016, what MSD put out to the voters was to turn off all those special taxing districts and approve a district-wide it's a property tax, 2 cents for $100 assessed values for regulatory work and 10 cents per $100 assessed value for maintenance and operations. So after this passed, then MSD had the funds for maintaining and doing regulatory work for the public storm sewer system. At this point in 2016, capital improvement projects, which would deal with the flooding and erosion issues, were not included as a part of this fee. So then in 2019, MSD came back to the voters to try and address those flooding and erosion issues by establishing a district-wide fee specifically for capital improvement projects for the stormwater side. This was through an impervious surface charge, and it would have generated around $30 million a year. Now, these funds would have specifically been used for those capital projects for localized flooding and erosion issues. Unfortunately, the voters did not approve Proposition S in 2019. And so what that means for right now, for our purposes in our conversation, these are the current MSD's stormwater responsibilities as written by our charter and not amended by the voters of our service area. So right now, through the 2016 Prop S, MSD has the funds and the capabilities and the responsibilities to operate and maintain the public storm system. Right now, creeks and streams, and this will always be the case, creeks and streams are privately owned. I'm sure you guys will see property lines extend out to the banks of creeks, and that shows that they're privately owned. And floodplain management still remains a municipal responsibility. So this is kind of give us some context to understand where we're at right now and what limitations are put on MSD in terms of stormwater responsibility. Just one thing that I have to remind everyone on, for us to start doing these capital improvement projects, it has to go through MSD's rate commission. It has to be approved by the rate commission. It has to be approved by the board of trustees, and then it has to go back to the voters and be approved by them. So unless that process happens, these capital improvement projects are still remaining unfunded on the stormwater side for MSD. So I think that's all I have for the general context. I think, Jeff, the next slide starts with the actual investigations and the agenda. Okay, I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you. Thank you, Saad. And again, thank you to the task force for giving us the opportunity to present our summary here of the investigations that we've done. So real quick, what we're going to go through here today, and I'll try to keep it moving fairly quickly. We're going to talk quickly about how MSD identifies projects. We'll go quickly through the sites that we investigated and the projects that we subsequently identified. Talk a little bit about service requests that are received by MSD, and then wrap up with kind of the future of stormwater funding. So, and this is pretty critical. Normally, so for this analysis, our program planning group, which I'm a part of, I lead our stormwater group, we went through and looked at the survey responses that the city provided us so that we could evaluate those and see whether any of those would lead to MSD projects. Normally, this process would be a service request that would go to the engineers in our operations department. So that's kind of the normal process that projects get identified. This was, like I say, a little bit different scenario, but that was fine in this case. So the process, really we start with a site investigation, whether that came from the list that we got from the city or whether it would be a call from a resident. We make that site investigation. Then we would, the next two items kind of happen in concert. We try to score the project, and we also come up with a conceptual scope. And so for the score, what that is it's a benefit cost ratio. But in this case, our benefits aren't dollars, they are points. And we do that to make the process a little bit easier. Sometimes it's hard to figure out the value or of different items. So by applying a point system, it just makes that scoring process go a little smoother. The other thing that it does, it allows for more equity across the district. So for example, if you have a residential home that is being flooded, and that home is a $400,000 house, it would get the same number of points as a residential home that might be a $100,000 home that is also getting flooded. So it just provides a level of equity in that respect. And so because this is kind of an important issue, this is just a small snapshot of our scoring spreadsheet. And I wanted to touch on a few things here. Let's see, there's my mouse. Can I do?
I think it's the pointer options. There you go.
Yeah, is that showing up as a red dot now? So we, in this case, we're looking at stream flooding, and this is erosion due to streams. In this case, for the projects that were identified by, or the issues that were identified by Wildwood, by far that encompasses the majority of them, so I'll focus my time here. Again, you can see that depending on the type of the structure, they have a different point value. So habitable residential structures get one class of points. Miscellaneous structures that might be on a lot get another class. We have another category for other types of structures. And really the key here is the ratio. So what we look at when we're scoring these is the height of the bank versus the distance to the structure. And so then based on that, that scores a ratio, and then that scores points that land you in one of these categories. So, you know, that's kind of the basis of it. I guess what I will say is just because a project, there's erosion out somewhere, if it doesn't score any points, then, you know, that doesn't bode well for it being an MSD project. And the other thing is, you know, we identify this conceptual scope and the scoring kind of in concert. So if the scope isn't going to resolve the problem, then you can't claim any points for it. I think that's maybe self-explanatory, but we want to make sure we hit on that. And finally, we develop a cost estimate. And again, these are conceptual studies, so they're pretty rough in their design. We don't go into a lot of analysis. It's more of a you know, we've been to the site, we look at the available data, and we come up with a solution. We use a cost curve system to come up with that actual cost. So we don't get into the calculating quantities and those types of elements. And just to real quickly go through, this gives us what we call a conceptual study, and that's where we identify our projects. That's where we have scored them. That gets them into our system, and that's kind of where projects live then until we get funding. When a project has been identified to be funded, we'll take it to the next step. We'll do a preliminary study. At that point, we do a little bit deeper dive. We'll look at utilities, quantities, reevaluate the site to see whether anything has changed. Maybe some limited survey. If it requires some modeling, we might start getting into that element. And that really gives us a budget and a more defined scope for it then to proceed to design. And in design, that's then where you get into your full survey and design plans and specifications. So that's just kind of a quick overview of the process. The other way that we identify projects, so that this would be normally through a customer service request. The other way would be municipal stormwater master plans. And I think I've heard that that's something that the city is maybe considering moving forward with. Certainly we've reviewed these projects that were provided in the survey, but if the city does complete a master plan, we certainly would be interested in it just to be aware of what all is in it. And then we would look at that. And if there are projects identified in that master plan that qualify for MSD's project scoring methodology, then we would incorporate those into our system also. So just real quick, this is Wildwood is outlined here. There's a light tan dotted line. Watersheds are a brown line. There's a darker brown dotted line here, which represents the district boundaries. You all are probably very familiar with this. It's this lighter area here in the middle where MSD's boundary overlaps with Wildwood's boundary. And so that's the area where we were focused for our analysis. I guess one question I'll just throw out here, but we can talk about it maybe after the presentation is, you know, what is the city's distribution of stormwater and erosion issues that you see inside of MSD's boundary versus the areas that are outside of MSD's boundary? Obviously, the city is quite expansive, and so there's probably more than, you know, almost 2/3 of the city is outside of MSD boundary. So maybe we can talk about that at the end. This is a representation of where the survey requests were from throughout the district. So each of these gray dots represents one of the locations that for the address that was provided. There are approximately 54 of them, I believe. You can see that they are primarily, a lot of them are concentrated on either the tributaries or the main stem of Cox Creek. We got a few of them on Bonham Creek, and then a few of them that are scattered in some other areas, maybe not directly adjacent to a creek. Just getting right into it. Based on our investigations, we identified 14 projects that are related to the investigated sites. 13 of those projects were related to creek erosion. One of them was yard erosion and kind of flooding. Of those 14, 10 of them are newly identified. 3 of them were existing projects that were already on the books for MSD, and one of them was actually completed here just in the last couple months. So let's see here. You know, so let's see, I guess one thing that I will touch on, there were roughly 54 project or sites that had been provided. There are 14 projects. How does that relate? Well, a few things. Some of the survey responses seem to point to the same locations, you know, so the same, they would be referencing the same issue. And so maybe one project might cover more than one survey response. There were other locations where there may have been an issue, but it just didn't warrant a project on our scoring system. And finally, I think one of them was outside of the boundary, and one of them we never got additional information to where we could identify exactly what the issue was or where the project was. So all in all, there were of the 50 some odd locations, I think my rough estimate, again, it wasn't something that equated real easily, but 21 of them were related to one of these 14 projects. And then there were 33 of them that are, you know, maybe not related to one of these projects. So this slide is an overview of projects that MSD has identified inside of this area. And I know it's kind of small. Later on in the presentation, I'll zoom in on it a little bit more to make it easier to see. The red projects are newly identified. Blue projects were projects that were already on the books. This also does represent projects that had previously been identified by MSD. They're also just represented on this map. And so now I will just quickly go through the 14 projects that we did identify. The first of those is Baja Court, 16416 to 16432. I might not read each and every one of those. Here we identified 240 feet of 12-foot modular block wall. And so I'm not going to have examples for all of them, but I will show you some brief examples of what, you know, kind of what we came up with and what we saw when we were in the field for 3 or so of them. So this is one of them. This was from our field visit. This is behind Baja Court. It's interesting, we were in the field today, and I made the comment that 2D photos don't really do justice to 3D scenes. And so it's hard to really tell what's happening here, but this is a fairly steep bank behind Baja Court. And then there is, in this case, a fence right at the top of the bank, and the structures are not too far away. So in this particular instance, like it said on the previous slide, we identified a project for 240 feet of 12-foot high modular block wall. Again, we look for walls, at least at this level, in instances where we have limited area to work. So a wall is kind of the default in those circumstances. If we had more room, we would propose to lay back the banks and do something that's, you know, maybe some, some of the other examples will probably touch on that. So the second project is Cherry Valley Court storm sewer. This project was actually ID'd last year as a result of when we came out and visited with the Watershed Erosion Task Force in the January meeting. As a follow-up to that, some information was provided on this site. And so we went out and looked at that and identified that project at that time. The Clayton Road Sanitary Sewer Protection Project is one that is adjacent to some of the complaints, and they had mentioned exposed sanitaries in the sewer. That project is actually just, it's in construction now, so it should be moving forward. There was Eagles Nest Court. There's actually 2 projects there related to, I think, 3 different requests. So in the one instance, we identified to do some heavy stone revetment, and that's kind of our other go-to for stream locations instead of a wall. And then there is also an infrastructure repair project along Eagles Nest Court for a sanitary sewer that's located there. And that project is, I believe, in the bidding process right now. Finally, there's Evergreen Forest and Birch Forest bank stabilization is another we identified. Moving on, there is Evergreen Forest bank stabilization. So this is where we made a site visit this morning. And so several attendees were present, and we, if we want to talk more about that at the end, we can do that. There is Little Pine Court bank stabilization. Another one where we're doing some heavy stone revetment and with something a little softer above it, biostabilization. Similar at Log Cabin Drive bank stabilization. And so we will look at an example of that one. Here is a picture of the bank near 16269. Maybe I said Lone Cabin Drive, I apologize. And then here is an exhibit that kind of shows the extent of what we are proposing. So in this case, work that at this level, we've just identified these 3 locations where we would propose to do some bank stabilization. You know, as we got further into it, we would definitely want to look to see what kind of grade control there is in this area. Project might require some sort of grade control also to keep any head cuts that are moving through this section of stream at bay. Shiva Court channel improvements. So there was an issue on the survey along this street, and this is a project that the district has just completed within the last few months. Timber Tree Court bank stabilization is another that we've identified. Turnberry Place Drive bank stabilization is again one that was already on the books for MSD. We've got Wade Court bank stabilization, and I think we're going to look at an example of that one. So once again, I don't think the photos necessarily do it justice, but there is a bank. I think it's mostly in common ground, but because in some of these areas it was denuded of much vegetation, and it looked like there was the possibility that it could migrate pretty quickly. We did identify a project at this location also that kind of, again, demonstrates the extent that we are talking about at this point, this level of the study. Finally, we have Wildwood Meadows Court bank stabilization. And for this project, it's I guess similar to several of the other ones where the channel is in common ground, but there is some active erosion that was happening in this area. And so the migration as that channel continues to meander, appeared that there would be some structures threatened at that location. So I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but certainly there were lots of other sites that were identified where we did see erosion occurring. Oftentimes those were in common ground, and it was in an area that was farther away from a structure that would score points in MSD's system. And as this group is well aware, it's not ideal. Certainly, streams are dynamic and they're moving, and so that erosion is a natural process. I do understand that, in some of these instances, these streams are not stable, and so there is active erosion going on as they're trying to migrate or move into a new realm of stability. But if that erosion isn't threatening something, then that's probably not a location where MSD is going to identify a project, just because we, when the time comes that we have funding to be able to address these issues, we want to be able to apply it equitably and also to address the most important issues around the district. Other issues that were not necessarily addressed, detention basin maintenance. So there were a couple of the complaints that were related to that. And so those issues would be the responsibility typically of the owners of the detention basin. Most of those detention basins belong to either, if it's on a business, it belongs to the business or the HOA. And so maintenance that's directly associated with that basin would be the responsibility of the entity that owns it. And then roadside ditch erosion, that would be something that would be the responsibility of whoever maintains the road. If they installed a storm sewer system, then it could be something that could be dedicated to the district, and then the district would maintain that system, but we're not responsible for just roadside ditches. So I mentioned earlier that we would zoom in a little bit. So this is the northern half of the area. And I think I mentioned previously that there are a handful of projects that are shown on here that are in locations that don't necessarily correlate to one of the survey responses that was passed on. And again, the red locations are new projects. The blue locations are locations where we had already identified a project previously. In the south, there's a handful of them down here also. I'll just kind of stay here for a second, let people have an opportunity to look. And then afterwards, if we want to have some questions and need to flip back to one of these locations, we can certainly do that. So I mentioned that we wanted to talk about service requests to MSD's customer service from Wildwood. Went back and looked at the service requests that we have received related to stormwater inside of Wildwood, and since 2016 there have been 168 service requests that generated an investigation work order that then caused somebody to go out and look into it. And so I'm not sure whether that's a big number or a small number. I honestly probably thought that it might have been a little bit higher than that. But just kind of the breakdown there, the majority of them were related to blocked inlets. And so that's certainly something that MSD can address. And with our 2016 Prop S, we now have the funding to do that. So, our crews can address those issues. Issues that were related to erosion or blocked creeks were 22, flooding 26, and then other stormwater problems 43. Just in 2021, and this is through a couple days ago, there had only been 7 service requests submitted at this time. And so with that, I will turn it back over to Saad to kind of wrap up and give us a little bit of information here.
Sure. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure everybody on the task force was aware of was MSD's future plans for stormwater funding. You know, we're talking about projects that are identified but are still left unfunded. So what we're looking at is how to put it back on the ballot, how to put Proposition S back on the ballot. And what we want to do, and what we're going to do, what MSD is going to do is we have an election next week, April 6th, and that has to do with our wastewater rates and changes to our charter. After that election, MSD will be starting another version of its stormwater tours, stormwater listening tours. And what that means is basically we're going to go around to different communities within the service area, and we're going to ask them two questions. What services would you want MSD to be responsible for? And what rate would you be comfortable paying for those services? So in 2019, we did do something similar for that Prop S and the years preceding that. We thought we hit the mark, but there's probably 100 different reasons why it ended up not passing by the margin that it did. And so what our intent is to go back to the voters and verify what is it that they want us to be responsible for. And since it's a brand new responsibility, how would you want to fund that brand new responsibility? The thing that I want to mention on this is I alluded to it earlier. Since MSD is a government utility through a provision of the state constitution, we do not go through the Public Service Commission to adjust rates. We have an independent rate commission that is comprised of 15 local organizations, organizations like the League of Women Voters, Mound City Bar Association, NAACP, HBA, different just organizations that represent St. Louis. That 15-member organization then goes through the rate process, which takes about a year and a half, 2 years, which all the proceedings are public, available to public comment. And it has to go through that process. They have to go through their recommendations. So it starts with staff making the recommendations, the rate commission looking at those recommendations, making their own recommendations and edits to that proposal, and then sending it to MSD's Board of Trustees, who ultimately decide what goes in front of the voters. So in and of itself, that process is deliberately and intentionally long. Of course, when you were talking about raising rates for almost 1.3 million customers, there has to be some sort of process there. But the reason why I mentioned that is because the earliest that we're really looking at for something like this to be on the ballot would have to be 2023 or 2024. That's kind of the time limit that we would have to work on. And the reason why I mentioned this is because after this Prop Y election for our wastewater rates in April, we would love the task force assistance in going around to the service area located within Wildwood and speaking to residents and figuring out what the issues are, what they want us to do about them, and how much they would want to pay for it. And so that's kind of the reason why we wanted to bring this up, just not to leave you all hanging and say, you know, these have been identified, but we can't do anything about them. Our plan is to put it back on the ballot. It just really depends on what the voters want to see on the ballot.
And that ends what we have as our formal presentation. Contact information is there, customer service at the bottom. Also, if there are issues, or that number is certainly, if residents who might be watching or listening in, they are, if they've got an issue, that's a good place and the right place to start. And part of that reason being that gets it logged into the system so that there is a record there. Not that Saad and I don't like talking to people and can't help people, but if we take the call, you know, we're writing notes down and we may, you know, look into something, but it just doesn't get documented through the proper channels to make that record, which then allows us to go back after the fact and look for where we have a series of problems or maybe a bunch of complaints in a similar area that may cause us to need to relook at something and see whether there's a bigger issue there, and need to reevaluate to see whether it's something that MSD could be involved in. So with that, I think we're done. And I guess if there are questions, we can attempt to answer.
Sure. So thank you guys both for presenting tonight. This is excellent, and we appreciate you guys coming tonight. I have a number of questions, but before I start with my questions, I'm going to go to Mr. Berger, who has had his hand up.
Sorry about that. Multiple screens trying to get unmuted. Just a couple of questions here. First of all, Saad and Jeff, thank you for your time this evening. I know it's outside of working hours, and I appreciate the extra effort and time spent with us, especially this morning walking the property. So Saad, quick question for you, and then I've got one for Jeff. You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you really are tasked with two charters, wastewater and stormwater. Bills were attempted to be passed to fund stormwater. Can I ask, just for some history, why was wastewater funded from inception and not stormwater?
Honestly, I think Jeff might be able to talk a little bit about the history of that. I think the history of that a little bit better than I could. But I know that in the beginning, when MSD was created, it was created specifically to take care of wastewater services. I believe as time went on, stormwater responsibilities, which were built into the charter, weren't extended for the entirety of the service area. And for that I don't know why. The only way to get that service there is through the people voting for that service to be an option. And for us at the time, I want to say up until 270, stormwater issues weren't on the top of everyone's minds at the time. And I would say that's probably the best reasoning. What I will say is I can get you an answer. I can talk to the people who've been here the longest to get that answer and figure out why it wasn't built into the system. Because right now we wouldn't be going through this issue had it been built into the system. But at the same time, a lot of things in the charter weren't built into it that required a lot of changes and throughout the time. So to simply answer your question, I don't know. I really don't know why it wasn't built into the charter from the very beginning.
Okay. Yeah, that would be super helpful. If there's any investigation that you can just give me some context on,
sure.
If this is identified as part of the charter, but there's, as we're hearing, no funding mechanism to actually activate against that charter, how is that possible? That just seems like for us who are now in a position where we need some help, a pretty impossible situation for everyone to be in, including MSD. Obviously it's not a comfortable position for you all to be in. And then just on the back of that same question, whether it's for you, Saad, or for maybe for some follow-up, my rate personally has gone up 100% since I moved here in 2014. So to continuously hear from MSD that we don't have any funding for it,
right? What
are we funding?
Right.
It was 30 something dollars when I moved in. It's now like $68 a month.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously not a huge deal, but we need your help now and we're not getting it.
Right.
So that doesn't feel real good.
Yeah, I can speak to that for sure. And I know that there was a question about what's on the ballot this coming week, next week, about that as well. And it's all derived from that wastewater side. So when we say, and I know when we say we don't have funding, that doesn't really make sense when we have, a $1.6 billion program coming on the ballot this coming Tuesday. And the reason why is because that's specifically for the wastewater side. So when we say that the stormwater side wasn't built into the charter and there's no identified funding source, it's because specifically in the charter, it tells us we have to spend wastewater money on wastewater funds. To speak on why your rates have been rising, and you're right, mine have been too. I want to say that's pretty average around the area. I think that 30 to 60 is fairly average for district-wide. And you're right, $30 doesn't seem a lot, but when you times that by 1.6 million customers, it's quite a bit of money. And the reason why is because in 2012, MSD entered a $4.6 billion consent decree with the EPA, the DOJ, and the Missouri Coalition for the Environment. And this was an effort to provide a court-enforced schedule to have MSD come into complete compliance with the Clean Water Act. Now, MSD was already working towards getting to complete compliance with the Clean Water Act, but the schedule that we were on, that MSD was on, trying to balance rate increases with actually cleaning up the environment, was not deemed quick enough by the EPA. So just like 200 other municipalities or wastewater utilities, we were sued and put under a consent decree by the federal government. Now, this is an unfunded federal mandate in that we are fined $50,000 a day if we don't abide by their schedule, but it's not something that they directly provide the funds for. There are federally subsidized grant programs or loan programs, I should say, through the state that MSD applies for, but the majority of that work has to come from our customers. That's where the majority of that money has to come. So for example, Every 4 years, MSD comes back to the voters with Prop Y, and then asks, how do you fund the next 4 years of this consent decree? So the consent decree started in 2012, ends in 2039. So every 4 years, we come back and say, how do you want to pay for the next 4 years of worth of work? It's federally mandated, so we have to do the work. The money has to be spent. So this time it's $1.6 billion. So the next, until fiscal year 24, $1.6 billion has to be spent on these specific projects according to this specific schedule. And the question that we have to ask is how you want to pay for it, how the voters want to pay for it. Do they want to borrow money for it, or do you want to pay it straight through rates? For the past 20 years, because like I said, MSD has been doing the work of the consent decree before the consent decree was a consent decree. We have been, voters have approved between 65 and 80% to do the bond financing. So to answer your question, yeah, rates, you're absolutely right, have been rising, and they will continue to rise until at least the end of the current consent decree. And every 4 years, we'll come back and tell you how much they're going to rise by if we don't bond versus if we do bond. And that's a continuous thing. But the reason why I mentioned the two utilities in one is because that money that's being raised for that can only be spent on those specific projects, on those specific things on the wastewater side. So when I say when we have no funding for stormwater services, it's because there's literally no legal mechanism for us to raise funds and spend funds on those issues district-wide. There are in some areas, and that was that inequitable distribution of taxing districts that I was talking about, where you pay more and you get more services. And that's what we addressed in that 2016 Prop S. So that's kind of why those rates have been rising. And when we talk about that, the reason why I want to put that in context is if we add stormwater services to that, it's going to raise those rates higher because it's a brand new service that we would have to fund for. So when we're talking about sewer rates rising, we have to be very intentional about, is it the wastewater side that this is affecting, or is it the stormwater side that this is affecting? So I hope that answers a little bit of it. I know it's not the answer you wanted, but I hope that answers that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that was very helpful for me, and hopefully for everyone else. I would, if we can figure out any sort of understanding about, how does waste or stormwater get included in the charter but not get funded?
Sure.
That seems like a total miss to me. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. And
Absolutely.
not to dominate the time, so I'll try and be quick here. But Jeff, I just had maybe a couple questions you could answer. You had a little a map there of newly identified versus previously identified projects. As we had mentioned this morning, which most folks here weren't present, but we have had MSD out to our property. This was the third or fourth time in the last 6 years. So why is our property now just a newly discovered or newly identified project?
That's a fair question. And it might be partly that the situation has gotten worse. The way the system is set up, it's intended to make it as equitable and so that people can look at it and things are scored evenly, but there is a human factor to it. And so different people looking at it might not come to the same conclusion all the time. I mean, that may not be the best answer, but that's the best answer that I have.
I guess it wasn't documented, but last visit it was told explicitly, yes, this is a problem. We will put you on the list. We do not have funding. And that was about 2 years ago. So, I would hope we were on the list before now, but it kind of doesn't seem that way.
Mr. Berger. So I have a number of questions for you, and I'll take them just in order. Can you just put up, actually, you don't need to put this up, but you asked a question to us about our erosion problems and our flooding problems and how they relate in relationship to the MSD map that you showed. And Mr. Vunich or Mr. Brown or Mr. Ron can correct me if I'm wrong, but the majority of all of our problems with erosion seemingly are actually in the MSD territory. And so that's a problem. It's a problem because Wildwood has got a large land area in the area that you cover. In fact, the largest land area in the area you're covered. But historically, we've not been prioritized at all. In fact, our area has been not deprioritized, if you will, with very few projects. And so I think it's a little bit difficult for our citizens to want to buy into passing different things from MSD, specifically when we're not getting in return for the investment based off of at least the historic projects that have been put forth by MSD. And so when you put that map up, it actually aligns with a lot of the issues that we're facing. So I wanted to make sure that you guys understood there's some history behind at least some of the frustrations in our area, because we have so many problems in relationship to stormwater and certainly with erosion. So I do have a couple questions in relationship to that. So do you advise then for us, because we could certainly let all of our citizens continually contact you guys to make service requests, and you probably would have many hundreds of requests. We can do that if it's a quantity issue and you need our area to put more service requests in. I would think that that would divert time away from the work that this committee's been doing in identifying a lot of prioritized areas that would be best served by MSD placing their time. But if you thought that that would be helpful, we could certainly do that. So I know you said you were surprised by the number of service requests that were done by citizens. How do you think we should proceed?
Well, no, so yes, that's a fine line. We, you know, the district doesn't want somebody calling every day and reporting the same problem over and over. However, if they're calling and there's been a substantial change in a site or an issue that, you know, over the course of a year or two, that might warrant another call and have somebody come out and take a look at it. So I think it's a balancing act from that perspective. But as far as what the task force is doing, I think I've stated before, but I'm impressed that Wildwood has put together this task force. We want to be partners with this task force, and if the task force puts together some sort of master plan, we'd be happy to take a look at it. If you're interested in our comments on it at some point when it's being prepared, when it's finished, we can certainly take a look at it. And as I'd mentioned previously, if there are other issues that we are not aware of that are identified there, we will incorporate those into our project list. We have done similar activities with other municipalities in the St. Louis area when they've completed stormwater master plans. We will take those and if it qualifies, incorporate it into our system. So yeah, that is a great method for getting additional projects on the list.
Okay, so no, and I think, first of all, we're very happy to partner, certainly with you. So to that vein, I guess I have 3 more questions. So the timeline for the 14 projects that you now have identified, when would you be able to provide us at least with the timeline that you intend based off of what you anticipate for funding?
Well, and so that is the issue. There is no timeline as we sit here today. We will not schedule a project without a funding source. And so that's where we move from that conceptual stage to the preliminary study stage. And so until there is a funding source, those projects are kind of in a holding pattern, so to speak. And that's, a similar issue. We hear the same, I understand the frustration. We hear that from other places in the district that, people say, this project was identified 25 years ago. And, I'm still waiting. Nobody has ever addressed this issue. And it's frustrating. It's frustrating to the resident. It's frustrating to the municipality. It's frustrating to MSD.
So I've got 2 more questions, but I'm going to go to Mr. Vunich first, and then I'll come back to my next 2 questions.
Dr. Remy, I'll defer to you. I just have a couple of quick things, so I'll wait, but thank you.
Okay, so Jeff, I know you know about this. I figured it'd be worthwhile for me to show to the committee. So back in 2017, over by Wildwood Meadows, as mentioned, you all actually had a substantial project that you did with lateral sewer line replacements. And Mr. Runn and and our team did a wonderful job of the last couple months sending you guys a lot of the projects. And during that process, as you know, Wildwood Meadows suddenly had rock distributed on the common ground in and around a pipe without actually explanation to many of us on this committee. And to just show folks what this looks like, this is Strecker Road right here. This is your pipe here. And there was rock that was placed right in front of that. To give perspective further, I'm going to just take you guys through a number of different photos here. So to understand what this creek, this is a spot that we both know. This is where the new bridge is. This is all the erosion issue. And as you can see here, additional rock was also placed in that spot. And then to put it in further context as well, this is what the rock initially on the day that it was placed in that location. And then finally, the last picture I will show you is a picture specifically looking at the dirt from that point that you're seeing at the bank all the way through here. Over the past couple of weeks, some of this rock has already fell into the creek. And as this erosion task force is well aware, dumping rock into a location such as this doesn't necessarily fix anything. It could temporize for a moment, but this sort of riprap phenomenon actually will make this erosion in the creek that I started with showing you that picture worse. And so because of that, although we're appreciative that there was addressing of a problem that you thought certainly would be, that's how it'd be addressed, the concern of this task force, and certainly as we develop our stormwater plan, how can we get MSD when you decide that you have funds and you decide that you want to address an issue that we mutually agree is a problem? How can we get those plans in advance to make sure that they're at least going to be able to mitigate the issue at hand and not further worsen the erosion problems that we've seen thus far with such sort of more archaic methods to deal with these issues? Is there a way that we could partner so that you guys, when addressing these problems, can bring these plans to our city, to our task force, so that we can make sure that this is not a downstream problem eventually?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that when we are addressing projects, the city will have an opportunity to weigh in on that. You know, there's an easement acquisition process. There's, you know, so there will be all kinds of outreach. And if the parties involved, be it the homeowners association or the resident that's being benefited, or, you know, potentially the city, I guess, if people don't like what's being proposed or the project, then MSD is not going to do the project if there are unwilling participants from the property owners and others involved. So I don't think that will be an issue when it comes to addressing these formal projects. The rock that you showed the pictures of, that was a little bit different situation. That was not an engineered solution. That originated with a call actually from the city to MSD informing us that there was an erosion issue that we might want to take a look at because it might be threatening that sanitary sewer. So a crew went out and looked at it. They determined that yes, in that ditch that's coming up from the culvert that goes under Strecker Road, which for clarity, if that is just a culvert that goes under Strecker Road from one side to the other, that would not be an MSD asset. It might show up on our facility maps, but we don't maintain crossroad culverts. So that's probably the responsibility of the road owner, but that's neither here nor there for what you're asking. The concern is even though that's an outside bend of Cox Creek, and I agree with you that in the long run, if the creek continues to meander at that location, the rock that was placed in that head cut is not going to stop any creek meandering. The rock had nothing to do with Cox Creek proper. It had to do with a head cut that was coming up that ditch towards the culvert outfall. And that head cut was in fairly close proximity to the manhole that you could see in the picture. And so the ops crew or the engineer who was out there and took a look at that determined that yes, it would be a better idea to at least slow that down. In the long term, whether this stops it, it may not, especially if the creek moves. Is that rock sufficient to keep the head cut from coming upstream? I think it has a fairly, in my opinion, has a fairly good chance of keeping the head cut from moving, but it won't stop the creek from moving. And so at the end of the day, it might be a moot point, but that was the intent of what was done in that particular situation.
And we've talked about this. So for the full disclosure for the committee, Jeff and I have spoken about this, and I'm appreciative. Just in full disclosure, though, the homeowners association and the city were not informed that this was what was going to happen. And I know you mentioned that for other projects, but this would be an example, I think, where MSD had an opportunity, I think, to at least come back to the city and to the homeowners association who had no idea this was going to happen, and at least inform them that it was going to happen. And that certainly didn't happen. So I think that this was a good learning lesson for MSD to not to maybe perhaps alter the manner in which some of these other projects are taken. So, Mr. Vunich, your turn.
Well, Dr. Remy, I'll always defer to a task force member first, and I know Mr. Gunther has his hand up.
Mr. Gunther, sir.
Thank you, Joe and Dr. Remy. Actually, my question was something of a follow-up on Dr. Remy's questions. And as I was listening to the presentation tonight, I found myself asking about process and what is the typical process maybe leading up to today. And when I hear things like there's a problem area and our solution is a modular block wall that's 12 foot high and 240 feet long, or a heavy stone revetment, I wonder to myself, do you work with the city of Wildwood and say, this is what we think we need to do to solve this problem? And I ask that because I also note that you just mentioned about partnering, and that sounds encouraging. I'm wondering if there's a way where both parties can win in terms of we have best practices established here. We have examples of of living walls in Cox Creek that have held up and been quite successful. And why would we not apply that kind of a design to these as opposed to going to modular block walls or heavy duty stone retaining? We're also hearing currently, not in our area, but River to Pear is being rethought of because it's been over-engineered and made too solid. And we all moved out here not to live next to River to Pears, by constantly kind of throwing rock into the creek and hoping that it stabilizes everything. We're looking for natural solutions. So I'm wondering, going forward, is there a way for us all to work together? We identify a problem, and we know some best practices. Would MSD be willing to listen to the best practices that Wildwood's developed, as opposed to saying, no, if we're going to do it, it's going to be a 12-foot high modular block wall? So that's my long-winded question.
And my answer would be yes. We would be interested in working with the city. We have used, I'm not sure if it's the living wall product, but there have been instances where the district has used a wall system that had areas where there was soil material pockets that allowed there to be vegetation. I'm not sure whether that's what you're referring to or not, but yes, I think the district can certainly listen to what the city is offering. There's probably a limit to what we can do financially. So if those other solutions are exponentially more expensive, then we may have to have funding partnership to cover that. But all of that being said, yes, we're open to other solutions. And the solutions that we've come up with here, we have implemented similar things around the district, but we've also implemented lots of other ideas, methods throughout the district. And at this point in time, they are more of a placeholder than this is what this project's going to be, take it or leave it. we're not, as I mentioned, I think we're not getting into any detailed engineering design where you would start looking at maybe some of those other alternatives. And the walls really come in when it comes to creeks. You know, there's kind of two options that we have considered, and Cox Creek is got some, based on what I can see from it. I've not been out there when it's raining, but I'm assuming there's some pretty high velocities. So, you know, we look for something that has a component of hard armor, and then as you move up the bank, that armor can be reduced in its hardness. So, you know, oftentimes our philosophy has been to armor that toe pretty strongly. And I think, you know, there may be other methods and other practices out there, but that's something that the district has done in other places and had pretty good success. And then as you move up the bank, you might have what we called in some of these composite revetment, where you have a rock area, but then you've planted that rock. And then above that composite revetment, you have another area that is biostabilization, where there isn't any rock and it's just a plant palette that is used to stabilize that bank. But the further down in the channel you are, you know, those shear forces are stronger. And so that's where we want the, you know, either the hard armor or a composite of hard armor and plants. And then as you move up, it can get more plant based. The walls really come in where we don't have that room to lay the bank back. So that's why we throw that option out there. To be honest, the other thing, the walls are, of the two, are more expensive. So if it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another, we might cost out the wall just to be on the safer side.
Thank you for your answer, and I think it may lead perfectly into Joe, with your questions, and maybe you can reinforce what, no pun intended, what we were thinking of with the living wall. But I think a healthy first step is just to have both parties talk about what we think is best practice. Joe?
With the permission of the co-chairs, first of all, Saad and Jeff, thank you again for attending tonight. And your message has been very clear and consistent over time that for stormwater purposes, the district isn't able to fund improvements to the level probably you would like, and certainly the city of Wildwood needs. Saying that, is there the possibility that when the city of Wildwood begins doing stormwater improvements, that the district can waive review fees, permit fees, provide direct engineering support to the projects, as well as assisting in cost assessments for our purposes? And then would the district be willing to participate on a regular basis with the task force? Actually have somebody attend the meetings so that partnership, those lines of communication actually gets established in, let's say, a hard way, meaning you're here when we're talking about the problems we have. In some occasions that may mean you're not, it's outside the district, but as you can see from the map that you've generated and the items we've provided, a lot of it is in the district. And I think the task force might welcome your participation on a month-by-month basis. So are those things you could consider? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I think we can, you know, be available to attend task force meetings. We can give it a trial and see how it goes, whether we need to be in attendance at every task force meeting. I guess we'll have to feel that out, or whether maybe we have a standing invite and show up periodically. Yeah, we can. I'm sure there's a solution there that we can work out. As far as waiving review fees and permit fees, this is not my area. You know, we have our development review group, but I do believe there is a reciprocity agreement that the district has signed with many of the municipalities where, yes, the review fees are waived for those projects. So yeah, I'm not sure the circumstances specifically with Wildwood, if there would be a reason that that's not the case, but I believe that to be possible.
Joe, if you don't mind, I can talk to our development review team and get you a more specific answer on that.
Thank you.
And what I think there was, I'm not sure what maybe refresh my memory on what the other issue. I thought there were three. I think that was two.
Obviously, the district has probably one of the largest engineering staffs in all of St. Louis, the metropolitan area. And all of those engineers, for the most part, are versed in either stormwater or wastewater management. And so from that perspective, having that engineering support, if we have questions or if we come up with solutions, just to compare what you would do versus what we're proposing, and maybe put the best minds together and come up with the right answer the first time, that would be helpful. It's almost like you would be not necessarily a consultant, but certainly a non-paid consultant to our efforts as we move forward with some of our priority projects. Some of our projects like Mr. Berger's, the Triple Meander in Cox Creek by Anniversary Park, those things can't wait till 2024 for an election and then several years thereafter. So I guess what I'm asking, and hopefully the task force concurs, we think you could be a good partner for us. And I guess what we're hoping you would say is, yes, given our funding situation with stormwater, we can do some of these things that are atypical.
Yeah, so I think we would certainly be available to help review and offer guidance on projects that you're proposing, or to look over those elements. I don't think we're in a position where we can do the engineering, but we could provide some level of review. When it comes to designing many of the stream bank stabilization projects that the district does, when we do those projects, we hire consultants also to do that work. So while we do have maybe a large overall engineering staff, a lot of them are managing other contracts that are being done. And so, we have some level of expertise, there's no doubt, and we're happy to share the talent that we have and help in those. But oftentimes on the more complex, we certainly rely on the support of consultants to help us make those same decisions. As I know that's what the city's proposal would be also, is you would have a consultant on board that would be doing that work presumably. And so, yeah, I mean, we can certainly participate and bounce ideas off of each other, and as part of the development review process, you get that review certainly. But if there are things beyond that need some involvement, we can't dedicate an engineer or a certain number of FTEs to just addressing Wildwood issues. In program planning on the stormwater team, we are 4 people serving the entire district. So we're pretty thin as it is right now, but to the level we can, we're happy to help.
Thank you.
So excellent. Really fantastic questions. So one question I have then for MSD then would be, so we definitely want to partner from the city side and with this task force, but more globally, since you have your own engineers, also utilize consultants. We have a lot of folks, Mr. Hunich and Mr. Ron and Mr. Brown and others that are on this task force that have content expertise. What about considering in the upcoming year having an MSD educational day where you bring all your consultants and all the different city engineers and folks together and develop and agree upon best practices for how to approach these? Because what we thought might have been good in 1990 may be different in 2021. And if there's an opportunity for a dialogue, then the consultants that you may hire or your engineers may understand if they're approaching a Wildwood Creek or a Core Creek, there may be some differences on the impact of how you may mitigate some of these problems with upstream or downstream effects based off of maybe the different landscapes across those different municipalities. So I think if there's an opportunity where a development of best practices across maybe the entire region, there may be an opportunity that the addressing of a lot of these problems in different municipalities may in fact not be fraught with further downstream effects that may be negative. Is that something you guys might consider doing through MSD as an educational project?
That's not something that I can commit to as we sit here today. You know, that would require upper management support, and that's certainly a bigger commitment. So I can take that message back and we can have that conversation, but yeah, no, I would not be able to commit to something of that scope.
Okay. Any other questions?
Just one quick thing, because I want to keep this moving. I'm glad that, and appreciate both of you coming tonight again. It's been reiterated several times, but we do appreciate your time. Coordination, I think that's a big thing. I just had one question on the funding. How is the combined sewer funding handled by MSD? Is that all sanitary or is it divided up?
Yeah, you're right on that. Anytime stormwater touches wastewater, it's all wastewater. So it's allowed to come from that sanitary fund.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Berger, I think you have our last question.
Yeah, I was just going to maybe abut your point a little bit in that I think it's become pretty clear we're seeing a dichotomy between a clear charter and responsibility for maintaining sanitary and stormwater, while only one of those functions is really funded. From a general public perspective, if a sewer is failing, it's pretty clear you call MSD, right? Like a subdivision or an individual homeowner is not responsible for maintaining a sewer. If you have erosion on your property, suddenly, as evidenced by the conversation and the task force at present, the community has to band together to figure out how to tackle that problem. And so I just think, in a general sense, in terms of whether it may be education, as Dr. Remy was asking for, or just ways of working, I think things need to shift a little bit. I did actually, and maybe stupidly, bought a property unawares on a creek after growing up on Fishpot Creek, where we've had very similar types of issues. And I had never imagined with the state of the property when we bought it that we would have ever experienced anything like that. But yet here we find ourselves. And but again, not to point fingers of blame in any way, I think the way that we're interacting and trying to figure out how to resolve the issues maybe aren't working as well today as they could in the future. So just maybe something to think about, that I think there's a willingness to have a community and municipality combined approach, and we should probably take advantage of that.
Agreed.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely. Councilmember McCutcheon.
So Jeff, if you could put together maybe a list of organizations, corporations, collaborations, whatever, that might be available to us to help generate some funding, maybe some, organizations or groups that are willing to go together in collaboration with the city to address some of the more urgent projects that need to be done. So if you have some, insight into that, if you could share that with Mr. Vunich, I'd greatly appreciate it. Because it's clear to me from listening to you all that we're going to have to come up with a collaborative effort and look at different sorts of funding and able to get these urgent projects done in time for our residents that are honestly in peril.
Yeah, so I can go back and pose that question to see if anybody is aware of any organizations that support or, you know, provide funding for these types of projects. As I sit here right now, I'm not aware of any. I mean, maybe some grants through soil and water conservation or something of that nature would be probably the most promising, but I don't know, you know, if they offer, you know, if they offer grants and what the scope or requirements are of those grants if you get them. But I can ask that question and report back on if we can report back on what we find regardless.
Okay, I appreciate that because we have had task force members looking diligently for funding mechanisms, and we really haven't made a lot of headway. So a lot of times outreach, you know, and other people's collaborations and contacts that we may not even be aware of are either the direction to go looking for that. So I greatly appreciate that if you could check it out for us.
Certainly. Yeah, no, I think Mr. Sturman was probably responsible for that, and he and I have talked on that topic in the past. He may be more versed and better versed than I am on the subject at this point, but we can pose the question internally and see whether anybody else has good ideas.
And the other question that I have is, so are you aware of any kind of opportunities through the state or federal government? Do you have any, you're in public affairs side, right? So are there any contacts that you may have that could be beneficial to us?
Yeah, as you were saying that, that's exactly what was going through my mind of what type of things federal options or other options may have for this. And I can't come up with any at the top of my head. So what I'm going to do too is do the same thing as Jeff. I'm going to go ahead and pose that question and see if there are any of those funds available through different government sources as well that provide those grants. I can do that, and I'll report back to you.
Thank you very much.
Todd, are you, as a public utility, are you at all restricted from partnering with a city to apply for such public funds?
That I don't know the specific answer to, but I can't think of an instance where we have partnered with a municipality for something like that. But let me get clarification on that as well.
Yeah, because I think if you can get some clarification, it might be helpful because it may make us a bit more competitive if we've got partners in the area that are working. Okay, so
just one, Dr. Remy, is
yes,
there
sir.
a way we can get a list to maybe Joe or Rick Brown about the Wildwood projects and how they scored them from MSD? That might be helpful.
Yeah, Jeff, we're planning on sending that full list.
Okay.
Yeah, we can take the list that was provided and you know, we worked from that. We might need to do a little bit of cleanup work on it and make it a little more presentable before we send it out. So yeah, give us maybe 2 weeks and we'll come clean that up and we can provide you with how we addressed, or, you know, what our thoughts were on those individual issues.
Okay, thank you.
Can you share your slides from tonight as well with Mr. Bunich?
Sure.
And then my only final question is in regards to the timeline for the 14 projects, which I understand we can't develop a timeline until there's funding. Could we ask one request? Is it possible for you to look into potential timeline for when to address this Evergreen area that's in peril?
Yeah, well, so we're definitely going to have internal with us. When we were at the site this morning, we discussed that we would take it back and talk internally and see what options might be available. Again, from the stormwater side, there is no funding. There is a sanitary there. I don't know, if it is what the level of peril or threat is there. So I will let Others evaluate that and determine, and if they feel that there is a concern for that sanitary, that may be a window into allowing the district to partner and contribute some funds.
If you wouldn't mind, just to close the loop, would you just mind reaching out to Mr. Vunich in the next 2 weeks just to close that loop to see where that sits?
Sure.
Yep. Perfect. Well, Saad and Jeff, most appreciative of your time tonight. We look forward to partnering and certainly look forward to having you help and join this committee as we move forward in a number of different endeavors. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
For inviting us. I wanted to follow up on one last thing. When I was not a panelist, I heard someone ask about the ballot measures on Tuesday and getting clarification on all those. Obviously, we don't have time for that. We usually go through like a 30-minute presentation to go through all of them. So obviously don't want to go through that right now. What I will say is there is a public town hall, one final public town hall, virtual town hall tomorrow night. All of the ballot language, the summary of the ballot language, the process to get on the ballot, a recording from a previous presentation, a helpful video, slides, all of that is found on our website. I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat, the link to it. And I would say 95% of the questions we've come across have been answered with stuff on that webpage. So that's where I would point everyone to, and I would, if they can make it to tomorrow night's public virtual town hall, that's where I would encourage them to go, because if there's any questions left unanswered, our CEO and Executive Director, Brian, he takes questions from the public through that presentation. So I'll go ahead and, excuse me, drop it in the chat just so everybody has it. And if there are any other questions about Prop Y or any of the other charter propositions that we have on the ballot, let me know.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your time. Most appreciative. So moving on next, Mr. Vunich, would you just mind giving us a short presentation about the Stormwater Parks Initiative tax?
Yes, sir, Dr. Remy, and thank you. Dr. Remy, Mr. Archeski, and members of the task force, as you know, over the course of probably now a year, we've been talking about the need to find a funding mechanism for stormwater improvements. Tonight's presentation by representatives of the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District certainly brings home that message even stronger to each of us. There is no Calvary on the horizon that's going to rescue Cox Creek, Mr. Berger's property, or any others at the moment. And so from that perspective, a true funding source that the city can count on each and every year becomes much more critical. And there is an entity out there that can do it. It's our Parks and Stormwater Sales Tax. This task force has endorsed it, has set parameters for it. Tonight, though, the department is presenting to you some options. Those options relate to what is described in the memorandum as a three-legged funding stool, meaning that beyond the Parks and Stormwater Sales Tax, there are some other options out there for us to consider, which is the Capital Improvement Sales Tax, which funds not only our annual program, but is a key component in our 5-year planning process for capital improvements. And then there are other funding options such as general obligation bonds, certificates of participation, etc. And all of those are options that are available to cities like Wildwood for consideration. In the memorandum, the department identifies first how much money is collected on an annual basis from the capital improvement sales tax, which is on average about $2.2 million. We know now that through the estimates of our city administrator, Mr. Cross, and the finance manager, Don Kaiser, that we could anticipate from our park and stormwater sales tax anywhere from $1.2 to $1.4 million. And then finally, with general obligation bonds, certificates of participation, and others, those numbers can be substantial because they are carried over a number of years, not necessarily on a project by project basis. For example, we did a sanitary sewer project in our town center area, and that was in the millions of dollars. But all in all, the project was able to be completed as a single project within the confines of an abbreviated time frame, and then the property owners paid for it over the course of that period, which was, again, 20 years. So as you can see, there is options out there for us to consider. And for the most part, the department then describes that for all intents and purposes, and there are exceptions, Mr. Brown has emphasized this to me on a couple of occasions, the city works on a 2-year cycle. 1 year we do planning, design, and engineering, and the next year construction. Now that assumes that the project is generally one we're familiar with or have done in the past. So that time frame may go to a 2.5-year or 3-year project, but for all intents and purposes, we follow like a 2-year plan. And with that, we thought through how best to approach either the distribution of the parks and stormwater sales tax or a couple of other options. The first option is one that probably some of you weren't maybe expecting, but I did feel an obligation to at least offer it. And that is, most of our parks and trails are funded out of the capital improvement sales tax right now. The money that isn't funded for those two types of park and trail improvements is generally grants. And so if the city council were to concur, the parks and stormwater sales tax could be just dedicated to parks, that 1.2 to 1.4 million. And then all of the money that previously went to parks and trails from the capital improvement sales tax could then be dedicated to stormwater. And the department provided a table to let you see that how much that allocation is on an annual basis, and then a 10-year average, which is $1.6 million for that average. So in that scenario, yeah, the stormwater would be actually funded at greater levels potentially. And the good news here is that option already is in place. Money is available, and there is a good reserve already established. That makes the assumption again that we go to the voters with a parks tax primarily. Not to say that the money can't be set aside on an emergency basis, because there will be those. But for all intents and purposes, it brings roads and bridges and stormwater into capital improvements, and for the most part, dedicates them to the Department of Public Works. The other option is to basically do the parks and stormwater sales tax, but again, establishing within that confines how that distribution would work. And the department has provided you a possible scenario. There's probably many, many more. But as you can see, in year one, we begin with design, and that would be on the stormwater side. In year two, we would move to design in the park side, but we would go to construction in the stormwater side. Again, using that 2-year cycle. The distribution would be, for the most part, $1 million in construction, 200,000 in planning, design, and engineering. In the latter years, as we build reserve, hopefully, you can see that we shifted more of the money over to the stormwater side because of the nature of the projects and the fact that we have a lot of parks, and we probably don't need as much for parks and trails as we do, let's say, as we're kind of kicking this off. The final option is, again, use the sales tax from the parks and stormwater ballot as the funding source for general obligation bonds, and et cetera. Meaning that when you issue bonds, you have to pay the bond holders. That money must come from a source. And in this case, we would say it would be the parks and stormwater sales tax. So as we issue bonds, which can be in 10 million increments, $15 million increments, $20 million increments, we use that to guarantee the bondholders their payment. And so those are the options that we came up with. In terms of priority projects, we were asked again to kind of identify those. And as you can see, we've done it on parks and trails and stormwater. The stormwater ones should be very familiar to you. The parks ones came from the Planning and Parks Committee of City Council. I want to conclude by just saying that that committee has reviewed this approach and has endorsed the memorandum and feel that this approach potentially is one that the City Council should deliberate and ultimately decide. And with that, I've tried to do it quickly. I know there's a lot of information. I apologize, but I do know that we're already past our 7:30 cutoff. So thank you.
Mr. Wunich, actually, that was phenomenal. And just one comment. So just for the purposes of process this evening, since it's got those three different potential approaches, for the purpose of this evening, we would just need to entertain a motion to get this to council, and then council can discuss those three areas. Is that correct?
Yes, I would respectfully request from the task force authorization to send the memorandum forward for City Council deliberation. If there's a particular option that's favored, that could come along too, but if not, you can leave it up to the City Council to make that determination.
Okay, Councilmember Farmer, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I was actually going to do just that. I mean, my personal preference, I like kind of the idea of option one, where, you know, it kind of, to me, it wraps stormwater into a little bit like an infrastructure situation, but I'm okay with just passing the options along to the council in general, and then kind of letting us discuss that as a larger group and make some choices, hopefully.
Okay, so with that motion, is there a second? Seconded by Councilmember McCutcheon. Okay, now this is just going to be discussion certainly on the motion going to council. So Mr. Gunther, I've got you next, followed by Councilmember Rambo.
I had a question about the memorandum and the discussion of the 2-year plan and the planning and design and engineering fees relative to the construction. And I noted, I think it was for $100 million, a $1 million project, 200,000 was going to engineering and design. That's 20%. That's a $1.05. I just about fell on the floor when I saw that fee percentage. As Mr. Sturman knows, in the construction business and the architecture business, you know, architects are lucky to get 8 or 10% on a project, and here's 20% going. I'd much rather see the fees be reasonable and the rest of the money go to fixing our stormwater issues. So I don't know. I mean, if this goes forward to City Council, are we saying, hey, you know, we're going to give away 20% to engineering fees?
The general number the department typically uses is about 12 to 14%. It is high. I wanted to be conservative in terms of not knowing, but certainly I can adjust that if the task force would like, down to maybe that 10 or 12% number, and then shift the remaining funds into construction.
Mr. Wunich, do you need a motion for that alteration?
I'd like a motion and a voice vote if possible.
So, Mr. Gunther, if you want to amend the current motion on the floor to that, we can take that first.
Okay, with your approval, I would rather see the 10% fee going forward, with the balance going to taking care of the problems in the field, as it were, in the creek. So however you want to word that, that's what I would recommend going forward.
Okay, so do we have a second to Mr. Gunther's reduction of the current engineering fees down to 10 to 12% as recommended by, as mentioned by Mr. Wunich? Seconded by Councilmember Farmer. So with that, okay, with that, we're just going to speak on the amendment to the motion. Is there any further discussion, or we'll vote on the amendment?
Can I, I'm not quite sure, but before we vote, I really need a clarification.
Well, okay, you want to know exactly what we're voting on, correct?
Well, it probably applies more to the original motion than to the second one, so I'll wait.
Okay. Okay, if there's no discussion, Mr. Wunich, would you just mind just giving us the wording that you would anticipate for this?
Yes, I believe Mr. Gunther would like the planning, design, and engineering fees be no greater than 10% of the anticipated project cost.
Okay. Any further discussion on that, Mr. Brown or Mr. Ron, or anything further? Mr. Ron, you're speaking, but you're muted. Okay, Mr. Brown, sorry.
I guess I would just make the point that I think from Joe's perspective, this was really intended to be more just a planning exercise, not necessarily that the fees explicitly would be 20% to any consultant for project work, that we would budget 20% for engineering purposes. So, and Joe referenced, and I would also caution that from the public works standpoint, projects that require easements and permitting, which all of these stormwater projects will require easements and permitting, are typically at least 3 years in duration. So 1 year for engineering and another year for permitting and easement acquisition and then construction. So I wouldn't get too down into the weeds in terms of the schedule. You know, this is an approach to show how we could utilize the money and address the problems that we see. But you know, we're going to get more into the weeds later if this moves forward, and I think this would be parsed out on an annual basis, and the plan would evolve. So it would be a living plan in my mind.
Mr. Gunther, just for the motion, would you be amenable if there just was a range of 10 to 15% just in this as it goes back to council, or do you want that absolute to be no more than 10%?
I'm going back to the fact that our city was founded on being very efficient with our funding. And I read engineering fees. I didn't read land acquisitions or easement acquisitions. So, you know, things have a funny way. You put it in words and all of a sudden that 20%, it's 20%, you know, and we find a way to spend it instead of putting it into the actions in the field to correct the problems, to deal with what, you know, our citizens' needs along the stream banks. So I personally think we should stick to being more conservative about the cost of the fees. If they go up because of certain conditions, so be it. But I think if you go in with 20%, you're going to spend it, you know. So that's my personal feeling.
Oh, and you're the maker of the motion. So, but if so, that's fine. We can vote on this. But I guess the only question I would have for you, though, is if we further included in that item the land easement and all the other things mentioned by Mr. Brown, would that at least make it more palatable?
Then it shouldn't be in design fees. It should be the 100,000 could go into the construction, acquiring the land, not in terms of design fees, engineering fees.
Okay. Any further discussion on the amendment? Okay, so we'll take a voice vote first, and then if not, we'll go council member, we'll by members. So all in favor of the amended for the motion, please say aye.
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 Any opposed?
Opposed.
So we've got one in opposed. Any abstentions? Okay, so the amendment to the motion passes. Now we're back to the main motion. Councilmember McCutcheon, I believe you wanted to speak on this.
Yeah, I'm just a little confused because I think by state law, if we call this tax parks and stormwater, then that funding has to go to it. So Mr. Vunich, I'm not really clear on how the number one approach, I mean, what are we still within that framework? I'm not quite sure. I've read it several times and read it for our committee meeting, and I'm just still not clear. Can you help me out?
Yes, ma'am. As Mr. Cross has said, on the enabling legislation from the state of Missouri describes it as a park and stormwater sales tax. So that's how it would be identified within the confines of the ballot language, the actual language on the ballot. We would then identify if it's going to be for parks and trails only, or parks and trails and a limited amount to stormwater. You have some flexibility there. And so the intent would be under one would be to clearly state if it's for parks or trails, or if it's parks or trails, and a certain percentage each year set aside for stormwater. But the idea would be is that in lieu of using the parks and stormwater sales tax and splitting it in, let's say, every other year for construction purposes, to try to basically use capital improvement sales tax monies for that purpose. And again, I think there's a convincing argument that it does fund that particular item does fund it at a greater level than even the parks and stormwater sales tax would.
I thought it was, a great approach. I was just, you clarified what my concern was on the way you put the wording in on the ballot, because if we say storm, water and parks, then I mean, that's what we have to use it for. But with that explanation, I think we would be fine. I don't think there would be a concern. So thank you.
Obviously, your concern is a concern of all of us on the task force, is not misleading our residents and being clear in the ballot language what our intent is.
Thank you for that. And just for everyone's clarification, also the allocation for the funding between parks and stormwater can be adjusted annually. So every year we can adjust it differently based off needs. So it's not that we're stuck to one thing. The only other consideration, Mr. Vunich, I don't know that we discussed, but that'll certainly have to go to council, will be whether or not there'll be a sunset clause on this tax, or will it be in perpetuity?
Actually, the task force has said they did not want a sunset as part of one of its original motions. And so we would proceed forward under that unless city council were to change.
And did, I'm sorry, and did Parks and Planning also say the same thing? I just want to make sure we don't have a discrepancy.
Yes, they received the recommendation from the task force, and it was discussed, and there was no sunset proposed as part of its action.
Thank you for keeping me honest. Councilmember Rambo.
Yeah, hi guys. I'm sorry I was late. I was still in 6:30 start mode, and so I'm dressed in my grubby field clothes. That's why I've been paused on video. But yeah, we talked about this document in committee, and I was enthusiastic from the very beginning. I think it's a great piece of work. I would pat Joe and others on the back for having done it. I'm particularly in favor of the idea of cleaning up the interfaces between the competing priorities of stormwater erosion control and the parks. I love the idea of going to the people with a relatively clean proposal for a 0.5 cent of sales tax that goes to parks. People around here understand parks. Some of us are really interested in getting erosion control problems solved, but everybody loves the parks. And it's understandable and it's easy to justify, and it still gives us the flexibility we need to take a few bucks from one to help with the other, but we don't have to have this debate every year about, geez, 70% goes to erosion, but we need 90%, but we need, and then the parks get short shrift, and people start seeing it in the decline of the care and maintenance of our parks and so forth. That's really all I wanted to say. I love it, and I look forward to the discussion at council. Thanks.
Thank you, council member. Next up is my enthusiastic council member, Tano.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I was just thinking about this as we were discussing the options here, and I know that the council will discuss it. And it seems like, and I believe I'm going to echo what Councilmember Rambo is, which is that second option, I think, is what would be a cleaner approach to things. What I'm a little worried about option one is that kind of shifting money around, although it's nothing wrong with it. It also is susceptible, which they're all susceptible, but this one I think could hurt more, because we could have years where revenues are less than other years. And although I will shed some light on this, overall in the county, we in 2020 only saw a reduction in the overall county sales tax of 4.4%. However, if you were to isolate just Wildwood Town Center, and we saw that in the number because the town center has a SID, so it has got its own tax, that reduction was 22%. So it was far greater. And so that's just a snapshot of the impact. And, obviously in other parts of the county, it was more of a wash because some businesses did better than others. But seeing something like that, if there's a fluctuation in another year where there's another significant event, I think that would make it difficult with option one, because then one's gonna, you're gonna have to make adjustments, where the other option two is just more of a balanced approach between the two. So if there's an impact, both sides are going to feel it equally. So that's why I would suggest, or at least feel like option 2 is the better one. But the council will discuss this when that time comes. So that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Councilmember Garitano. So if there are no further questions or comments, let's go forward and vote. This is going to send the current memorandum as is, modified by the Gunther Amendment, back to the City Council, which would be and be duly supported by the Parks and Planning Committee, as well as the Watershed Erosion Task Force as is. So if there's no further, we will take a voice vote. All in favor of sending this to council? Yes, sir. Point of order by Mr. Garitano.
Yeah, just a quick question. Could you just restate what the Gunther amendment that was approved? I had caught part of it, but I want to make sure I understand it.
It's okay, baby.
Sure. Mr. Newberry, Mr. Vunich, would you just mind just reiterating our Gunther amendment, which we'll call it from here on in?
Mr. Newberry, would you repeat it, please?
Thank you, Joe, for the opportunity. I believe it was the amendment was to alter the memorandum to reflect a 10 to 12%.
10%.
That's correct. 10% for the engineering.
Thank you.
And just for clarity, for a point of view, is that just on the watershed erosion work?
No, sir, it would be universal across both the parks and stormwater. So the table will be adjusted to reduce the extent of planning, design, engineering, and approvals to no more than 10%, and then an accompanying increase in the construction due to that change.
So I guess my question is, the Planning Parks Committee already voted on the document as it is. So I feel like we would have to reconcile it as a council, because the Planning Parks Committee didn't approve it that way. And so I was asking if it was perhaps just on the watershed. Sounds like that would be cleaner. But if we're overriding what Parks voted on, I don't know if that's fair to do that to the Parks Committee when they haven't voted on it.
So, Joe, just in point of clarification, we can reconcile that at council.
Yeah, I don't see a problem with what Planning and Parks has done and then what this committee does. I mean, it's going to council and be up to council to make a decision. They may not even accept the Gunther amendment. I mean, that may come out as well. So I think we're fine.
Okay, I think as long as council's made aware of that, that's all.
And Dr. Remy, with your permission, I would probably add a footnote just to describe what the change was between the committee and the task force. So as Councilmember Garitano just mentioned, there's a clarification, so they're aware of it.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. That would be great.
Thank you.
Excellent, good. Thanks for pointing that out, Councilmember Garitano. If there's no further discussion, we'll move forward with the current motion to send this to council. We'll take a voice vote first, and if there's any, if it's a close call, we'll by an individual vote. So all in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, we've got unanimous support, and thank you very much for that. So committee members, and in just interest of time, I know Mr. Patton is here, and I've already spoken to Ms. Holthouse. We've got our education and then followed by our subcommittee for stormwater plan. But since I'm hoping that the next meeting will be dedicated to our subcommittees as well as Mr. Jones's group, is there any objection for us to postpone the remaining parts of the agenda to next meeting?
No.
Okay, and are any further comments by the committee tonight that people would like to just make any other additional statements? Councilmember McCutcheon.
Yeah, I'd like to address the start time. I don't know if the start time has anything to do with the number of people that are participating or not. But I know for me, it's very difficult to do a 5:30 start time. But even that, my greater concern is that if we have residents who have working hours, standard working hours, that they may not be able to sit in and view what's going on in the committee as well, with it starting at 5:30.
So, Councilmember McCutcheon, would you like to entertain a motion then to keep the start time remaining at 6:30? And Mr. Cross, do you have any comments about the start time for the meeting as well? Sorry, I didn't mean it. First, Mr. Cross first, and Councilmember.
Thank you, Dr. Murray. No, I have no opinion. It is entirely up to the co-chairs as well as this task force in terms of the start time. So as I had mentioned to you before, the staff is always available no matter what time you all decide to start your meetings. We will be there to support you, be it 5:30, 6:30, whatever. We're all in this together.
Councilmember Rambo, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I really do think it's important to make some semblance of quality of life for our overburdened staff priority one, if we can, if at all possible. But I got bitten by the start time change, and so I just want us to pick a horse and ride it. If it's at 5:30, I'll try to make it. If it's 6:30, I will have an extra hour to shower after I finish getting dirty every day and so forth. So I really just don't want to lose sight of the fact that the staff is claiming to be accommodating because they are, but they may have a preference, and I'd like to make sure that we accommodate that preference. That's it.
What, can I follow up, Ken?
Yeah, of course, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think our staff is excellent and they do a super job, and I always, feel bad for them because, they start early in the morning and go, late in the evening. I mean, maybe we can have a discussion, maybe at Admin Public Works, and find another way to support staff. But our number one priority, anyway, as far as I'm concerned, is our residents. And if our residents have difficulty making these meetings, at 5:30, then we work for them. And that's my first priority, is making sure the residents can participate if they so choose.
Thank you, Councilmember McCutcheon. And I'm going to go to Councilmember Garetano 1 second. But, I think it's reasonable for us to perhaps maybe discuss this at a work session. If that, Mr. Cross, do you think that would be a possibility that the council can discuss start times, or would you prefer us to punt this to Admin Public Works to discuss across all committees?
Thank you, Dr. Remy. I guess my opinion is that it's really up to the individual committees. There are different circumstances with the different members of that committee. And so I don't think we need a one size fits all, or to kick it to one committee to make the decision. I think each of the chairs of the committees, or the co-chairs in this case, can poll their members of that particular committee or task force and then make a decision. I just leave it at that level, and you all decide what you think is best for your particular committee. And when you make a decision, then staff will be there to support you.
So then, into that vein, if it's okay with this committee, if we could have the April meeting at the normal 6:30 start time, if we could put on the agenda for that meeting discussion of the time, that way we can then conduct a vote across the committee. Is that amenable to the group?
Yep.
That's fine, but is there a way we can do this just through email
We can do that too.
and solve it before we get to the meeting?
We can certainly do that. Mr. Newberry, is there a way for us to use our current survey tool via the city to just send out to all 16 members a start time for meeting?
We can figure something out.
Thank you, sir. Councilmember Garetano.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and then Mr. Cross said exactly a lot of what I was going to say. I mean, we already discussed this at Admin Public Works, and the direction by the committee by vote was that we were just going to reach out to each of the chairs and leave it up to the chairs to determine. But, with the ask that, if they could find a way to start meetings earlier in order to assist the city staff, to provide them with a better opportunity for a work-life balance, that if it's possible to make it work. And I think, in fact, there was even a talk of people saying start the meetings at 5 or even 4 o'clock, which, and again, it all depends on the committee and the people in it. So I would say that, and I think you can probably just ask this committee in an informal poll. It doesn't necessarily have to be a vote because we're talking about something that's procedural, that you can just find out tonight and just say, hey, any objections for 5, any for 5:30, and work your way till you find a time that seems to be consistent with everyone, or you could just send out an email and make that determination before your next meeting.
All right, thank you, Councilmember. I think what I'll do is I'll work with Mr. Archeski, we'll work with Mr. Newberry, and what we'll do is we'll send out an email that will address this, but also it'll also take into consideration the duration of the meeting, because if we could also keep the meetings perhaps at an hour and a half, even if we start at 6:30, we'll get done at 8 o'clock every time. And if that means we need to modify our agenda, I'd prefer to do that. So I think it's a great suggestion, and we'll take that on via email. Councilmember Rambo.
Yeah, just real quickly, I'm looking for consistencies. Ms. McCutcheon's exactly right about confusing the residents and making sure they can make it. And I know that she specifically has trouble making it home from work to get on these calls. And so there's an argument for having them later. So we have the tension between that and the city employees. But it makes a lot of sense. Maybe it makes some sense to send it back to the admin committee, just because I'm looking for that consistency. And I would hate to have WETF at 5:30 and REAC at 4 or whenever it happens. It's kind of random anyway. And then some of the other committees at different times. So it's hard for a scatterbrained old dude like myself to remember to look at the top of the agenda right before, the day before the meeting, and make sure I'm going to be there on time. So that's it.
Thank you, Councilmember Rambo. There are some comments that I'm not going to touch, and that would be one of them. However, I appreciate that. I think we'll send out an email to this committee, and I'll leave it to Mr. Garitano if he wants to take that up further with Admin Public Works. If there are no further statements by this committee, can I have a motion to adjourn? Motion is made by Councilmember Clark, seconded by Councilmember Farmer. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? And with that, I appreciate everyone's time. We went 34 minutes over what we intended, but thank you very much for all your time.
Dr. Remy, you want to stay on with Travis and we can
Sounds
briefly
good.
discuss this?
Sounds good to me.
Thanks.
Good night, everyone.